Coming up on this week's Racing News Show, Geraint Thomas defends his second place at the Giro as Pogačar continues to ride away with pink. Sam Bennet is back to winning ways. Demi Vollering to the GC victory in Burgos. And we ask if it's too early to think about Pogačar winning the Tour. So, Pogačar is the man in pink, but who wore it better? I say Sam Bennet at the 4 days of Dunkerque last week. Bennett was almost as dominant as Pogačar at that race too. More on that later though. First though, we learnt that Pogačar himself went a whole week without winning anything. The middle week of the Giro d'Italia concluded yesterday with a Queen stage to Livigno. That had more altitude gain than any stage of a Grand Tour over the last 4 years. Huge days in the mountains with a high altitude finish have historically been a bit of a weakness for Pogačar, but he certainly put that to bed yesterday. Everyone knew that Pogačar and UAE wanted to win the stage, but having seen him ride a little more conservatively on Prato de Tivoli a week before, a few of us expected a similar type of performance. Get the win, just don't dig too deep for it. Well, we were wrong. Pogačar gave Majka the telltale nod with 15 kilometres to go, then blasted away from his GC rivals and set off in pursuit of the early breakaway. Within 2 kilometres of making that attack, Pogačar's lead over the group of Geraint Thomas was a minute. That is bonkers. By the top of the climb, he was some 2 minutes 22 seconds ahead. Now, some of that was down to some cat and mouse in the group behind, but most of it was Pogačar's legs. He averaged 28 kilometres an hour for the final 5 kilometres of the penultimate climb of the day, a good 3 to 4 kilometres an hour faster than anyone else. He started the final climb to Livigno with 40 seconds still to make up on Quintana, but made short work of catching and passing the Movistar rider. He could have afforded to take it easy in the closing metres, were it not for them being so horrifically steep. It really was a demonstration. His advantage over Dani Martinez, the next best of the GC riders to cross the line, was 2 minutes and 50 seconds. With the bonus seconds, that means he now leads Geraint Thomas by 6 minutes and 41 seconds with 6 stages to go. The biggest margin at this stage of the race in decades. It's the first time that Pogačar has won more than 3 stages in a single Grand Tour, and you wouldn't be at all surprised if there was more to come. Also, according to Stats on Cycling on X, it's the first time he's won a race or a stage of a race with more than 5,000 metres of elevation gain. Given the kilojoules burned by others that uploaded to Strava on the day, that might also be a sign that he's no longer fallible on longer days at high altitude. Thymen Arensman, who, for example, uploaded his ride to Strava, complete with power data, had burnt 5,300 kilojoules before he even got to the last 25 kilometres of climbing. Arensman himself moved closer to Antonio Tiberi in the young riders classification that day. Despite his work for Geraint Thomas, Pogačar had already increased his lead over everybody else in the second individual time trial on Saturday. However, on that occasion, his performance wasn't good enough to beat a relieved Filippo Ganna. The Italian champ was a man on a mission over the 31 kilometres, averaging over 53 kilometres an hour despite the 350 metres of elevation gain en route. That was his first win in 8 months after what had been a relatively slow start to his season by his standards. Pogačar is remaining cautious of claiming the GC win as sewn up just yet though, saying to GCN reporters that he didn't think he wanted to jinx things just yet. Naturally though, at this stage, barring disaster, Pogačar has the race in the bag. And already the discussion of whether this form will translate to the Tour win in July is shaping up. I think his performance over the weekend will have many of his rivals quaking in their boots. There's a small, chink in Pogačar's armour, and if that would be the case, it would be in the high mountains. But let's be honest, after his display of performances over the weekend, that isn't the case anymore. Remco, Vingegaard, Roglic are going to make for a big competition, of course. But on this form, it's hard to look past Pogačar. If you could ask any question, potentially you could say that this is the first time he has attempted a Grand Tour double, a feat which shouldn't be underestimated no matter who you are. He's obviously on top form now, but can he recover and get back on top in just 6 weeks' time and get through a final week of a Grand Tour in the meantime? Pogačar is right, of course, to be cautious, saying to GCN that he was looking forward to July, but he had to survive this upcoming week first. Personally, I think Pogačar will be very, very hard to beat at the Tour. He looks to have stepped things up again this season, but of course the real question will be answered in July. Let us know what you think in the comments section down below. Back to the Giro though, and in the sprints, Jonathan Milan emerged as the dominant fast man of the race. After 3 sprint stages shared between Merlier, Coy and Milan in the opening week, the Italian was the only sprinter to raise his arms over the last 6 stages. As such, his lead in the Ciclamino Jersey competition is substantial. He'll go into the final week with an 89-point lead over Caden Groves. Valentin Paripancha had taken by far the biggest win of his career on stage 10, dropping Romain Bardet and passing Jan Tratnik towards the end of that summit finish. But the most entertaining stage of the week came 2 days later. Julian Alaphilippe set out on what most people thought was a suicide mission with 130 kilometres to go, going clear with Mirko Mastri of Polti Cometa, with a really strong group behind them. It really felt like they were on a hiding to nothing. But we shouldn't have doubted, should we? The exploits of those two that day were really quite incredible. Their average speed over 193 kilometres with 2,200 metres of climbing was 46.7 kilometres an hour, close to 30 mile an hour. For the 137 kilometres he was up the road, Alaphilippe averaged just under 300 watts, and the duo reached the final climb of the day with 45 seconds over the group of Navarras behind. But Alaphilippe didn't relinquish any of it on the way up. Unfortunately for Maestri, the writing was on the wall for him as they hit those steep slopes, but you have to tip your hat to him too. That is a day he will never forget. In part because Alaphilippe had a special delivery for him a few days later. A lovely gesture that, but how good is it to see Alaphilippe back at his flamboyant, entertaining best? That was his first win since last year's Criterium de Dauphiné, and we all know the trials and tribulations he's faced over the last couple of years. This is how the GC looks then with 6 stages remaining. Pogačar with a more than comfortable lead of 6 minutes 41 seconds over Thomas, with Martinez a further 15 seconds back. O'Connor isn't too far off a podium place, he's 47 seconds behind Martinez, whilst Tabiri and Arensman are the only others within 10 minutes of the pink jersey. In the mountains classification, despite the efforts of Gesca, Scaroni and Quintana, and others actually, Pogačar has more than double the points of everyone else. He sits on 172, whilst Gesca is second on 78. Antonio Tabiri continues to ride at a consistently very high level. Now, as well as sitting in 5th in the general classification, he's also leading the Best Young Rider competition. Although, as I said earlier, Thymen Arensman is now breathing down his neck. That's going to be an interesting one over the last week of the race. One other story that came out over the stage yesterday was that of Jenthe Biermans of Arkea B&B Hotels. It emerged that the Belgian had fallen 25 metres down a ravine on the descent of the Motorola. Couldn't move and he lost radio contact. Speaking to Sporza at the finish line, which he remarkably managed to ride to, Biermans said that 4 teams helped to look for him before eventually pulling him back up to the road. Can't actually believe he managed to finish that stage. Thankfully, all in one piece. It was a 7-hour stay in the saddle for him. Anyway, that's it for the Giro this week, but a reminder that you can watch the final 6 stages live and uninterrupted on Discovery Plus and Max. Just before I move on to other races, another quick plug for our shop and the huge collection of t-shirts and sweatshirts that are available, including the one that I'm wearing right now with an Italian theme. If you'd like to take a look at what's on offer and maybe even make a purchase, just head over to shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com. On to the Vuelta Burgos now. There was a really nasty crash actually in the final kilometre of stage 1. Former world champion Elisa Balsamo of Little Trek slammed into and through the barriers at high speed. Initial examinations revealed a fracture of the nasal bone, the second metacarpal of the left hand, and a concussion. Bad, but not as bad as it looks like it could have been. Sofia Bertazzola was also involved and had a fracture to her left forearm. Get well soon, Sofia and Elisa. That opening stage was won by EF's Lotte Hentala, a huge win for her, particularly as Irene Webers was in the sprinting field too. Webers got her stage win 2 days later, but the first GC shuffle came on stage 2, with its summit finish to Alto de Rosales. No surprises to see Demi Vollering reign supreme there, but she was pushed close. Evita Muzic finished just 4 seconds behind. Vollering's lead going into the 4th and final stage was just 8 seconds, but it was a hell of a lot bigger than when things were wrapped up there. Vollering attacked on the final climb of the day with around 17 kilometres to go, catching and passing early attacker Lucinda Brandt, and arriving at the line almost a minute clear of her. It took Vollering until the 2nd of May this year to rack up her first win of the season, but 17 days later she was already up to 8. Meanwhile, at the 6-day-long 4 days of Dunkerque, Decathlon AG2R continued their incredible season with a man who hadn't won a race at all before the race started. Sam Bennet had to settle for third on stage 1, behind Milan who gave Cofidis their third win of the season, but Bennett then won 4 of the next 5 stages. The first 2 of those were in sprint finishes, whilst on Saturday he won the hardest stage of the race into Cassel. He came really close on stage 4 too. 22-year-old Wout van Glu of Soudal Quickstep almost made the catastrophic error of celebrating too early. He got away with it. Just. His first win as a pro was just millimetres ahead of Sam Bennet, who thought he'd nabbed it on the line. The Irishman was of course the red-hot favourite going into the 6th and final stage, and he duly delivered. 4 wins from 6 stages, a 2nd place, a 3rd place, a win on GC and the points classification. That's not a bad haul, is it? It means that Decathlon and Jours are now up to 20 wins this season, bumping Visma Lease a Bike down to 4th place in those rankings. UAE still lead, they're now on 35 wins, whilst Little Trek are 2nd on 22. A couple of other races to round up. Tord Gummelstad of Uno X took the first win of his career at Veenendaal. He beat Simon de Haas and Dylan Groenewegen in the sprint, whilst the women's was won by Rhiannon Marcus of Visma, who soloed to the win in front of Barbara Goreski. Yesterday at the Antwerp Port Epic, Laura Gillespie took by far the biggest win of her career. Another Irish win, I might add, for the week. She got the better of Zoe Bagstead to the line, whilst Alexander Kristoff took the 90th win of his career in the men's, out-sprinting Emilian Jeannery of Total Energies from a small group. Arnaud de Lee had to settle for 4th place, although I'm surprised that result still stands. He twice took his hands off the bars in the sprint because he was boxed in, so I was expecting a relegation. Just finally, there was a double success for EF at the US National Champs yesterday. Kristen Faulkner and Sean Quinn won their respective road races for them and will be racing in the Stars and Stripes for the next year. A couple more bits to wrap up now. Mathieu van der Poel has decided that he will ride the Tour de France this year but skip the Olympic Games mountain bike event in favour of the road race. That decision had hung in the balance until recently. Meanwhile, the transfer rumour mill is in full swing already. You can read all about it on our website, globalcyclingnetwork.com. Last week, there were rumours that Red Bull, Bora Hansgrohe were after Tom Pidcock, despite being under a long contract with Ineos, whilst UAE are already busy finalising their 2025 roster. Apparently, Jasper Philipsen is off the table, but they're re-signing Rafael Majka and possibly Mark Hirschi as well. You can read all about that over on our website. We'll put a link in the description below. Right, that's all for this week. We'll be back next week to wrap up the final week of the Giro, as well as the Tour of Norway, in which Wout van Aert will make his competitive return, the Bourg de la Mayenne, the Ride London Classic and the GP Marcel Kint. See you soon.